Good morning, everybody. My name's Andrew Wilson, and I serve as the Executive Director of the Center for International Private Enterprise here in Washington, and I'd like to welcome you this morning to our session on press freedom and how authoritarian regimes limit operating space for press and media. I'd additionally like to thank the National Endowment for Democracy for their support for this event. The NED is a key supporter of CIPES, and we are always thankful for their support. Before I move into sort of framing why our organization is interested in this area, maybe I should tell you a little bit about CIPE for those of you who might be unfamiliar with us. The Center for International Private Enterprise is a not-for-profit organization. We're an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and one of the 4 core operating institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy. Our mission in the world is a little bit of a hybrid. We serve to promote democracy around the globe, but through the framework of private sector development and economic reform. And as such, our lives constantly touch on the intersection between markets and democracy. And so when we look at issues like press freedom at CIPE, we come at it with a particular viewpoint, a business community perspective on these things. And we thought today it would be interesting to offer some perspective on how governments that restrict information can also affect, in a sense, both the media environment but also the business environment from our perspective. As I mentioned, markets and democracy are intertwined. They're mutually reinforcing institutions. And the values that business needs, that the business depends upon to develop in a competitive format, are also the values of a democracy. When we look at things like accountability, access to information, transparency, et cetera, these are also all very important business practices. And business, in essence, relies on the free flow of information to do its work well. If you take a look at corporate governance inside a firm and what a business needs to do to make decisions and determine risk, it really needs to be able to get all of the information on a certain market or a certain environment in order to make a healthy investment decision on behalf of its shareholders. And the same areas, the same sources of information that a business might rely upon are ones that media often rely upon as well. So when we see a closing space for media in an environment, we also see a closing space for business information. And for us, it's critical that that open access to these things are always in place. There's also the importance of what a free media means to the private sector and what it means for business development. Free media helps create a competitive environment in economies. By putting information out there, by making access to information equal to all, it really does break down a barrier to entry for the private sector. Access to information is often key in a business venture, and I can't stress that enough. But it's also helping businesses achieve a level playing field. When media, for instance, uncovers corruption, whether it is petty corruption, the day-to-day bribes that a small business person is forced to pay, or it's grand corruption where people are stealing from the state accounts or otherwise. That's important. That's important information. That's an important leveler of the playing field for the private sector. And it's also very important check on business ethics itself. And media is an important policeman when it comes to the private sector. It unveils crony relationships between businesses and government. It unveils abuse of state-owned enterprises that might distort a competitive environment when they can abuse their position within society. And it acts as a general check on unethical business practice. And from our perspective at CIPE, coming from the business association world, media freedom is incredibly important for us as an advocacy tool. It helps give voice to business. If the press is limited in its ability to reach out and to show a variety of viewpoints, democracy suffers. And we look at places right now like Russia where we see a closing media space not only for the heroes that we see fighting corruption and otherwise, but also within the business media. I read today, again, where ironically Vladimir Putin came out today and gave a speech stressing the importance of media freedom on the same day that 3 editors resigned from RBC, which is the most important business journalism institution, independent journalism institution in the country. We see the control of business information as also a tool to control the space and the environment. If people aren't allowed to report on business relationships between government and the private sector, we see in Russia that manipulates democratic space as a result. It's very dangerous. And when we see a clampdown on media, we often see a clampdown on business as well. We're seeing that in places all around the world. In Russia, I just mentioned, the clampdown on the private sector occurs at the same time as the clampdown on media freedom. We're seeing this in places like China, where SIPE's partners often face the same sorts of persecution that other human rights and media freedom activists face because they speak up for access to information. And we see it in countries all over the world. We see it in Iran and other places where the government is effectively clamping down on voices of the private sector that demand greater transparency, that demand greater accountability within the private sector. We see them being clamped down with the same vigor that we see free media proponents face persecution. It's a joint struggle. And that's why we're so proud today to have this panel here to start discussing some of these issues and perhaps bringing some perspective to the commonalities that we face as both business community and media in a struggle for freedom. And I wouldn't hesitate to mention as well that media is a business and that it needs to operate in free spaces in order to do its job very well. Our panel is very talented and has great insights today, and I'm going to let Ken do the introduction, but I will turn to and introduce Ken Jakes, who will be moderating this panel. He is the director of our communications division here at SIPE, but he's also a former journalist himself, working at CNN years ago in its political shop, and then working in government affairs and relations in a number of emerging markets around the world, including Georgia and Serbia and other places where he has worked with governments to coach them in how to be better stewards of information and how to be more transparent and accountable in their work. So Ken, I'm going to hand it over to you and wish our panelists the best of discussions, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Well, our panel really doesn't need much of an introduction. I mean, all of them are very recognizable. We have Gina Chan. She is a columnist with Reuters. And before coming to Reuters, she was with the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Quartz. She's also covered Iraq, and you trained journalists there.
Yes.
Yes, so and you wrote a book on the Khmer Rouge, I believe, too,
Yes.
as well. So,
all very uplifting subjects.
Exactly. But you bring a vast amount of knowledge to the panel, especially in the area of business reporting and financial reporting. And Deborah Amos is the international correspondent for NPR News. And I'm also proud to say that years ago, I worked as a researcher when I was a young cub journalist back at Congressional Quarterly Magazine on her book Lines in the Sand.
Very good one, too.
And I recommend everybody reading that. Here's a plug for your book. So, but she also worked for years at ABC News in television. She is one of the most recognizable voices in radio and in journalism around the world with her outstanding coverage of the Middle East. And she has won so many awards, I can't even begin to talk about it because we'd be here for the next half hour doing that. So, and Jim Sciutto, who's also a former colleague of Deborah at ABC News, where he worked in London. He is now the chief national security correspondent at CNN. And also, he's going to bring some insights today that is going to be very valuable to the discussion. He was also the chief of staff to the U.S. ambassador to China. I guess that was in between ABC and CNN. So, but I really want to start out about, if you're an investor here in the United States, you pick up the Wall Street Journal every day, you go to your websites, and the information that you're getting is transparent. know that the information you're getting from the SEC is transparent and accurate, that the information on companies are accurate. But if you live in a place like China and Russia, and indeed a lot of different places in the world, you really don't know if that's the case. Freedom House just put out their reports. Anybody here from Freedom House? I think we had some people. Yep, good. I think the latest figure was, let me take a look at it here. Only 13%, according to your information, only 13% of the world's population has a free press. So about 75%, or no, 85% of the world does not enjoy what we enjoy here in the West. And actually, press freedom has declined to its lowest point in 12 years in 2015. A lot of places, like you're going to talk about today, you literally can be jailed and killed for taking chances that we take for granted here in the United States. So I want to go ahead and start with our panel. I want to start with a question for Gina. Gina, can you trust the information that authoritarian regimes disseminate? And if not, how do you compensate for that?
Well, I guess in short answer, a lot of times no, which does make it very difficult. And I'm going to actually focus a bit more on the business and economic side of things, just given what some of the other panelists will discuss. So it's actually very apropos that this panel is taking place today, because yesterday there were a series of important meetings in China between Treasury Secretary Liu and his counterparts in Beijing to try to address some of these issues given the problems that China's been having in their markets. So for the first time, they agreed to a U.S. investment quota for for U.S. investors to buy into Chinese stocks and bonds for about $38 billion. All of these things are supposed to sort of open up the markets there. But frankly, U.S. investors are pretty reticent because they can't trust data in China. They can't trust corporate governance issues. Even simple things like GDP growth or trade data that just came out is very difficult. So it is very hard for journalists and for the business community to make decisions off of that. I mean, luckily, in this day and age, there are, because of technology, because of social media, even in authoritarian countries, there are ways to try to get information. China is more integrated into the global economy, so others like the IMF and other global organizations do have information, but it's very tough, and it makes trying to make business decisions and for journalists to report on stories and confirm their accuracy very difficult.
Jim, let's go to you. I mean, this is a nice follow-up for you. Do you think what the Chinese have done, their government, does censorship really work for them?
Yes, absolutely. I think it does. I mean, shockingly well, even in this age. The great irony is we have so much information now, but the internet provides both the opportunity for information, but also the opportunity to disseminate false information or to stifle dissent. And China has built an unprecedented operation to stifle dissent and control information, largely via the internet, but not exclusively. I mean, they have literally tens of thousands of people working to look for certain words and phrases. I mean, a classic example is June 4th, right? We just passed the 27th anniversary. And the reason we know it works, and I lived there for 2 years most recently, is if you talk to people born since then, so people who don't have a personal experience of it, didn't live through it, if not personally, at least lived through the time in China, they either don't know much about it at all, don't think it was that major, buy the government line that it was relatively small, that it was agitators fomented by the West, and they were controlled in a heroic effort by the People's Liberation Army. I mean, that's the narrative today for folks who didn't have a personal experience of June 4th. So it worked, in the year 2016, when you or I could easily Google accurate narratives of the Tiananmen massacre in China. You just can't. They do a great job of it. I'll just give you a personal story. of another one I experienced while I was there as outside of journalism as chief of staff to the ambassador. While we were there, if you remember the case of Chen Guangchen, the blind dissident, who was in the embassy while I was there, famously kind of, rescued in this crazy car chase around Beijing between an embassy SUV as it was chased by unmarked Chinese security cars, taken into, when he reached out to embassy staff saying, "I'm being followed, I need help." So he's in the embassy for a couple of weeks, very tense time in U.S.-China relations. It was a big story here. It was, an enormous story inside the government as Secretary Clinton, the president, everybody tried to figure out what to do. This was you had a Chinese dissident inside U.S. embassy walls, held for his own protection at the time of the strategic and economic dialogue too, sort of incredibly enough. So I remember, in the midst of that, and I couldn't, because I was inside and a lot of what was going on was classified, but people knew, eventually once they knew he was in there, it was a big story. So it was public, and it was a big story here in the States. And I remember driving home one time with our driver in Beijing. You could have a driver. I'll never have a driver again. But anyway, he was a good friend of the family. And I remember sort of in my broken Mandarin just saying, "So I'm just curious, what do you think of the Chen Guangchen case?" And he was like, "Who?" He had no idea who he was. Now, some of that, a little of that is that we in the West often will kind of attach ourselves to certain dissidents that have more effect outside the country than inside the country. But this is a guy who had real street cred. He was, the barefoot lawyer. He was originally celebrated by the Chinese government as someone who was advocating for the rights of the poor, the uneducated poor, the disabled, et cetera. So this guy had real street cred. But the government successfully stifled this major diplomatic row between the U.S. and China in the year 2013, an age of supposedly endless information. Censorship works, and they do a great job. Now, thankfully, people in China find a way to get around it. China, the internet censors will censor particular words or phrases, and then very quickly netizens will come up with homonyms for those phrases so that they could get around the, June 4th, or Chen Guangchen. They found different phrases that were not on the censors' sort of bad list so that they could comment on them. But that's a small minority, frankly. For the larger part of the population, sadly, it works pretty well. And we see that in other countries. You see it in Turkey now. You certainly see it in Russia with the story of Ukraine, how Russians see it versus how we see it. It's a sad fact.
Well, Jim, one of the things we see in Russia is not only does Putin use propaganda and his control over the media for political reasons, but also financial, obviously, because he's so closely tied in with the oligarchs. He's protecting his friends there in their inner circle. And we see a lot of that coming out now with the Panama Papers. We have a journalist here from Russia who literally left the country because of death threats over there. And she'll talk a little bit in the Q&A session here. But do the Chinese, do they protect the oligarchs in the same way, or is it more political, the reasons that they use their propaganda machine?
Goodness, well, if you're on the right side of the government, they'll protect you. Otherwise,
Just
they'll
like
throw
in
you in
Putin's
jail.
government.
A couple of them are ending up on the wrong side of the law. Exactly, just like
in Russia.
Do they protect the oligarchs? It's a little different in China because the state-owned enterprise. I mean, China has its oligarchs, but then it has these enormous state-owned, and Gina knows this better than me, but state-owned enterprises that are basically business arms of the government, right? And the economy depends on them. But I mean, now you're seeing the politics wound up in the economics because as part of this, party purge that's going on. I mean, sometimes it's for political reasons more than business reasons that guys fall afoul of the law. I mean, that was while I was there, the other big controversy we dealt with was Bo Xilai, if you know that whole story, and the fall of, a once powerful oligarch in effect. But that is not any guarantee of your security.
Deborah, how do you see this in the Middle East play out? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of different dynamics that are going on, but especially since the fall of Iraq, what is your experience in how those governments over there really try to control information?
I want to go backwards, though, for 1 minute.
Sure, absolutely.
And I came to Tiananmen a week after the events there, and we all said, now what? How do we cover this? There's nobody on the street. And I had come out of the Middle East, and I had learned how to read dictatorship TV. And there was something to watch. you could tell when they were nervous about something, how they ignored it, how they covered it. And so I turned on TV and I said, this is just like Saddam. So I know exactly what to look for because they all operate in the same way. Yeah. But since then, I think so many things have changed with how authoritarians control the media. And my boss, Will Dobson, has written a book called The Learning Curve of Dictators, and he should be up here as well. And he writes, and I have observed, that they're just much better than they used to be. There's more tools. They are more subtle. They want legitimacy. And to be a crusher of the free press is not a role that they want to be in. So they use the law. They use subtle pressure. They use, I can get you kicked out of your apartment if you don't toe the line. There are all these ways. And to go back to how it works in the Middle East, I observed the Syrian regime reeling in the beginning of the revolution because they were facing activists who were brilliant at using social media. And this was really very new in Syria. And they were broadcasting like crazy inside the country after the regime had kicked out all the international media. They don't have a lot of resources. But what they understood, and they understood it because it's what the Russians do, it's what the Iranians do, what they understood is your strategy is to sow doubt to your own supporters and people who are on the fence. And that was their media strategy. And frankly, it works very well. It is building an alternative reality. And we are all sophisticated enough to watch the news in a different way, but the general public is not. And so when they see that doubt, and I saw it this week when Buthaina Shaban came to Washington and said boldly, no one is starving in Syria. Yeah. We don't like that food the UN gives us. Syrians are proud about their food. We wouldn't eat those crackers. No one is starving in Syria, which is in direct contradiction to reality and widely reported sieges of towns. It is an alternative reality. She was speaking to her audience back home. She was on the air in Washington claiming that there was nothing wrong in Syria. So I think it is a harder job for everyone who's trying to promote freedom of the press these days because there has been a learning curve of the dictators.
It's good that we never fall victim to alternative realities here in the U.S.
I
Never.
said this to
We were just talking about that
So
before this
good.
started.
I said all of the Americans use these tactics. They do.
All the yeah, in a very sophisticated way, extremely sophisticated ways we all see. Let's talk a little bit more about Syria, or Iraq, as a matter of fact. In 2010, you wrote a paper and laid out the case that the news in Iraq is delivered through sectarian lens. Has that changed very much since then?
No. It goes back to 2003. The U.S. military was tasked with creating the media again. And it was because the usual organizations, it could have been you, there were many organizations internationally that come in and help rebuild the media. But because that war was as political as it was, those people stayed away. So it was the military that put together Iraqi State TV, which was pretty terrible. And it spurred the growth of private media. So what happened in Iraq is you have Sunni TV, you have Shiite TV, you have Kurd TV.
Who was funding that, by the way?
Private business.
Local private business? Any coming from the outside?
Politicians, private business, militias, political leaders. So you have 200 channels. And as part of that paper, I was able to get some interesting research from a company that did it for the military. And they said, we'll give you the numbers. We won't do the analysis. I said, OK, I'm going to make it simple. I want to look at one story. And it was a story that said Ahmed Chalabi had challenged Ba'athist before the 2010 election. How many times was that story covered across the sectarian media? Sunni TV did it 1,000 times. Shia TV did it 300 times. Kurdish TV did it 0. It wasn't important to them. What's a little bit different about Iraqis is they watch 5, 6 television network news because they have to. If you need to know how to get your kid to school in the morning, you can't depend on your sectarian media to tell you everything, and they know that. So they watch more TV. Certainly than Americans do. We cocoon, we stick to our political comfort zone in what we watch. But Iraqis can't afford that. It's more dangerous for them. So the good news for them is they watch across the spectrum. The bad news is the spectrum is there. There's no one source of news anywhere in Iraq that anybody can depend on.
I'm glad you bring that up, because this is not unique just to the Middle East or Iraq. Every developing country I've ever worked in, whether it's Latin America or Eastern Europe, it's all the same. You walk into a town like Belgrade, and you'll literally see 75 to 100 newspapers. Each one of them is owned by their own different political interests or business interests. They might have a circulation of 50 people or so. But the television and radio is exactly the same thing. They're all pushing their own ideas. Jim?
I just want here's the thing, and not to, the U.S. is different, and we do have more choices, and it's not Iraq. But what's interesting is that siloification, right, of news is happening here. And one thing stuck on my mind, I was listening to Deb's channel the other day, and it was the New Yorker Radio Hour with David Rebnick, and he was interviewing this guy who puts campaign trail interviews to music. I don't know if you heard this story. But the one I heard, it was just of a millennial voter describing her just trying to absorb information. So here's a generation that does not watch the cables, probably doesn't listen to much NPR, probably doesn't read much, Reuters, that kind of thing. They get their news principally from Facebook. And she was saying, one complaint is, I see, my friends posting stuff that is diametrically opposed, just on the facts, and I don't know which one to believe. It's interesting. So we have that happening here, kind of the equivalent of Kurdish and Sunni television. If you read the Facebook post, and I could see it in my own Facebook feed, right? Yep. You have one reality over here that says X, and one over here, and never the twain shall meet.
Yeah.
And it's remarkable that as you have this diversification of news outlets, you have almost less informed people to some degree.
That's very true.
I agree.
Yeah.
In 20 years ago, when I was at CNN, at the time you had ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and then you had a few NPR and a few other people. And now we're just inundated with information everywhere, and it's become more commercialized and more info news. You see it on the right, you see it on the left, and I still think CNN's right in the middle. I hope. But that's what we've really seen here in the United States. So you do see business interests and political interests seep in to the coverage and push their own agendas there. Gina, let's get back and talk a little bit more about, you did some training in Iraq of journalists. I've trained a lot of journalists in my time, and I know, Deb, you have too. Jim, I don't know if you have or not, but does corruption affect the work of journalists in the countries that we've all worked in? You want to start?
Yeah, no, it's a huge problem, and frankly, it's a bigger problem for local journalists than foreign ones oftentimes. I mean, frankly, I had certain protections when I'm overseas as opposed to my local staff, who are much more subject to being thrown in jail, having their families threatened, having their livelihoods taken away from them, and we can do a certain amount to try to protect them, but in the end, a lot of times they can be left to their own devices, so they have to be much more careful. Deb was talking about the sectarian issues. When that was really bad at times in Iraq, and arguably it is again now. You literally had to have staff for your Sunni staff that could only go to the Sunni areas because there were all these checkpoints that they had to go through, and you had to show your ID and everything. And then you had your Shia staff that could go to Sadr City or other places like that to deal with the Shia militia. So. And a lot of times you have to, pay bribes to get through. I remember in Iraq, for whatever reason, they did not give you an AIDS test when you were coming in, but they would give you one when you would go out. And that's, to get your exit visa for foreigners. So for whatever reason, they apparently didn't care if you had venereal diseases when you come in. But and basically, it was only to get foreigners to pay to avoid having to get that test, because frankly, no one's going to want to go to an Iraqi hospital and get a needle stuck in them. So there are various ways that they can get around this. You mentioned Russia. I mean, right now, because of the sanctions, corruption's a huge problem, and the hiding of various businesses and the ownerships of them has become much more pronounced because they are trying to they're trying to avoid the sanctions. So right now, certain individuals on the Russian sanctions list will only get tagged if they are majority owners of a company. So that's at least 51%. So a lot of these companies are now being restructured so they're less than 50%. And you go to Treasury and you're like, come on, that's just because Treasury has the division that is the main sanctions enforcer, and you ask them, this is just a total ploy to just get out of your sanctions. And they're like, well, if they're not violating it in terms of the letter of the law, there's not a lot we can do. So there's a lot of things that are being done to get over certain rule of law issues, and it's a huge problem. Not to mention just the day-to-day of being pressed for bribes. I remember when I used to live in Cambodia, everyone had $100 under their bed, because if your house catches on fire, the firemen will come and they'll just frankly watch it burn down unless you pay them. So these are some of the places that we operate in, and operating as a journalist and as a businessman or businesswoman is very difficult.
Well, let's talk a little bit about like the lower levels of journalism and get away from the government propaganda. In every country I've ever worked in the developing world, if you're a company or you're an entity, you could literally walk in and talk to a journalist, you pay them, and they'll write anything you want. Mm-hmm. Jim, was that the same way in China? I know it is probably still in the Middle East, Deb, but in South America and in Eastern Europe, it was very, very prevalent.
No, there's definitely that relationship in China where it's almost accepted, right? Where you have journalists for hire.
It's not really even a bribe. It's just a way of doing business.
It's right information strategy, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean there aren't hard-working journalists there, and there are, and I've met them, and they try, and
the same wherever I've worked too. You do have some that are really honest, hard-working journalists.
And you see people who work even in the state media, right? Who, they know the sort of the rules and the limits, and then if they perceive that they're getting bullied too much, they might protest, and you see that even at the state broadcaster like CCTV. So you have folks who try. But it's really hard, and you definitely have a financial relationship between companies and business magazines, and the exceptions to that have a following, like Caixin, which is a good and has been respected business magazine, business publication in China. It did some real reporting. So you do still have that, and it's kind of amazing to me that they survive in a place where price, frankly, is high, because if you don't. And it's arbitrary, right? If Beijing decides that whatever you report is a state secret, particularly in the economic category, it could just be, I don't know, a prediction of some state-owned enterprise's, debt burden, right? That could be a state secret, right? From the view of the government. So it's a you think primarily that it's political journalists that are in risky territory, but in China it can be business journalists, right? It's arguably the most sensitive information.
As well. What about in the Middle East?
Saddam was the best at this. After he died, it was, the stories came out about cars and trips and college educations for journalists, but not just in Iraq, across the region. I think now what you see more often is journalists know what they're supposed to do. In many places, even in Jordan, you will get a call from the palace if they don't like what they see, and you know that. And the lines are clear. I think China's different because it's strangely a little bit more open, and more is at stake, and they know about business, and they want to deal with the West. The Middle East, not so much. So the corruption is much more subtle in how it works. What I also find in the Middle East is there's a cadre of young journalists who want to work for Western correspondents. And they are fearless, so fearless that you are always afraid that you'll burn one, because they will take risks. And working with the Western press is one way to sort of fly a bit and learn some journalism and do some good work. But it's dangerous for them. But more and more, we rely on these people. Just this week, NPR lost a brilliant Afghan journalist. And we were talking earlier about the roulette of war coverage. He was a lawyer, had a young family, and he always went out with our correspondents. And they all say they could have never done their work in Afghanistan without him. He knew the ropes in ways that you can't because you're not living there all the time. You don't speak the language as well as you should. And these people are exemplary. And I'm sure that you will tell us this as well, regimes now know that the best thing to do to a journalist that's pesky is let them leave. It used to be they all went to jail. What a bother. Give them an exit visa. That is the better way to handle it. There was a story on the radio this morning about 2 Cuban brothers. Both of them had been in jail, both dissidents. One went to Miami, and the other one said, I'm not going. I'm not going. I'm going to stay here, and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to go back home. But a lot of people have to leave because it's the only way to survive.
Very interesting. Jim, one of the things that you wanted to talk about a little bit is we talk about these individual countries and the way they control information. Are any of them really working in tandem? Is Russia, China, some of the other ones working together? We've seen this at CIPE where there's NGO laws around the world that are basically kicking out democracy groups. Are they kind of doing the same thing with
I don't think they're
the
working
information space?
together. I mean, there's been a lot of talk of that kind of Russia-Chinese alliance, right, against the world. But the truth is they have enough competing interests that it's hard to see that. In fact, they have, particularly over in the far east, there are real worries among Russians about China dominating there, just because there's just no Russian population there, but China, a lot of Chinese across the border there. So I don't think that they collude necessarily, but they do follow the same playbook. As Deb was saying earlier, you see these same tactics in so many different countries, regardless of culture or history. Or history, or you name it. Each has its own narrative, but they use the same. You see the same. You see it in Turkey, right? Turkey's a NATO ally, and they're getting journalists fired and kicked out of the country, right, for reporting their news. And what are the consequences, right? They're not kicked out of any international organizations that I've seen recently. No. So the thing is, you see those. I spent a lot of time, particularly when I was in London, spending time in authoritarian regimes. I lived in China, but Russia, Zimbabwe, Myanmar, went there a few times under the old leadership. And what struck me is that the tactics were identical.
Yep.
And here you places, it's different races, different
That's the thing that
continents.
amazes me. It doesn't matter where you are; it's all the same.
No, and each has a different histories, you name it, and yet they follow the same thing, and also have a similar kind of narrative to justify it, right? Historical subjugation, victimization, all this kind of stuff. And it's we are the ones, and the West is trying to dominate us. It's identical, right? It's identical.
We've talked about traditional media. What about the new media, social media, Facebook, Twitter? I know this is very prevalent now in ISIS, their narrative, using social media. What about dissidents there? How are they pushing back against some of the voices of, say, ISIS or the governments there?
I'm going to actually tell you a different story, and because it's on my mind, and it's about Saudi media, which is authoritarian, but not as much as China. but it's stodgy and it's old-fashioned, and it's tribal, and you have links to the palace to be a leading journalist, but nobody under the age of 30 watches it. Nobody. And they know it, and they can't fix it. And so instead, the government is beginning to use social media to reach a population that under 30s are 65% of the country now. And so very popular things are starting to show up on YouTube and social media that you scratch your head and you think, that was clever. So a young soldier is in Yemen, and he files every day. He's on the front lines, and he's got 1 million followers in Saudi. And that is where young people are getting their news on Yemen, unfiltered. He's not really political. He's just kind of telling you.
What platform is this?
He's YouTube.
YouTube.
It's usually YouTube or not so much Facebook. Saudi's a big Twitter country. 2 months ago, the Saudis allowed a Kuwaiti prince to come into their operations room in Yemen because he had a big following and they knew it. Nobody has been able to do that. No Western journalist, nobody's been able to do that. But he could come in because they are trying to figure out, how do we reach young Saudis who have turned off, they don't read our newspapers and they don't watch our television. And I suspect that the Chinese think about that as well, that you can shape the news, but there is a moment that you have to reach people because they don't really believe everything.
What about the dissident voices? What are those governments doing to try to clamp down on that on social media, or can they?
Well, in Saudi, they just put you in jail. The dissident voices are usually arrested under the terrorism laws.
What if they're from another country? Do they have controls over social media there?
They don't.
They don't.
They don't. 2010, I was in Syria just as the internet had become wildly popular. And I said to an activist, I said, I don't understand how a government deals with this. There's all this new information that's coming into the country. And he said, well, they can't control the media, so they must control the people. And I think these regimes are very good at signaling what's allowed and what's not. In places where you can't get Facebook and Twitter, Erdogan went on state TV and told people that they could use VPNs. That's what he did. He said that publicly. However, it is still illegal in a vague law to use either of those social media platforms. So what kind of message is that? I'm the president and I do it. I suppose you could do it, but it is illegal. So it puts people on edge a bit on what's allowed and what's not. And it
Probably on purpose, right?
Exactly, yes. None of this is done by accident. And so I think there is a very sophisticated strategy to control people and what they look at. I don't know China very well, but I'm told that that's exactly how they work it in China.
So I always find this insane, right? America's premier technology companies are blocked from China. Facebook, Twitter, Google. Google had a fight, and then they didn't like the censorship of searches, which is one of China's big information.
Even with VPN? You can't do it with VPN?
No, but with VPN you can't. So VPN, and VPNs are kind of, don't ask, don't tell kind of situation where you have them officially, they're not, they know that they're there. But, like everything in China, that is regulated as well. So I had a VPN there, but the VPN, they have like a valve on the spigot, and when they want to slow down VPN or just make it spotty, they can do it. If things are like around June 4th, for instance, happens like clockwork, to control that. And they know that it's only a segment of the population that's going to go the VPN step, the urban, millennial, educated, whatever. And that's small enough. They're not like the hundreds of millions of masses. So it's a very similar situation.
And it's a valve.
It's a valve.
That population, small as it is, it's everywhere, and you give them a little.
Yeah.
And they can look.
A little bit of a say. You're right, exactly. The social media can in these places be, you open the valve a little bit, let people spout on Weibo, Sina Weibo, which is their kind of Twitter situation. Let them spout there better than in the streets. Oh, but it's getting too much. Pull it back. Ooh, that one person is really aggressive. Let's go put them under house arrest. Or if we don't do that, let's threaten them and make their family worried. This kind of thing, so that they calm down a bit.
Well, I just want to add, just sort of on a sort of maybe more positive point, I was talking to a Chinese venture capital investor, and we were talking about all these startups in China, and as VC investors now, you face a lot more competition. Everyone wants to fund the next Alibaba, be the next Jack Ma. And so how are people figuring out, who is legit and who's not in this space? And she was actually saying that's where social media, Weibo, and other sites actually play a huge role, because through those means, you can find pretty quickly, who's legit or not. If someone tries to tout themselves as a big investor who can help you, take your company public or whatever, they're quickly sort of found out if they're a fake or not as legit as they pretend to be. Same with shareholder rights. Corporate governance is obviously a bit lagging there, but when there's been issues of M&A deals or take private deals where they feel like a founder is trying to take it back cheaply and basically screwing the investors, there is more of an outcry, and through social media, through other means, that they can actually get the word out and sort of try to shame various executives. But that can only go so far. As to Deb and Jim's point, I mean, there's other things going on in China right now. One of the biggest things we're watching is their debt issue. Their non-performing loans on Chinese books have doubled basically in the last 2 years. The problem is because a lot of these banks are state-owned or state-affiliated, you don't actually really get to know their balance sheets or understand them. Some people think actually that their debt bubble could be even worse than the 2008 crisis we face, but because it's so hard to get information there, we're all in the dark. And this time, if that is the case, it could be worse just because they are so much more a part of our global economy. There's tons of U.S. banks that have exposure to China. JP Morgan alone has about $18 billion in exposure. So, that's something that not only affects investors and people there, but possibly the rest of the global economy.
Well, before we go to Q&A, I just want to end by just asking the panel, is there any mechanisms or ways that we in the West, where we have more of freedom of the press, is there any way we can kind of push back on some of this behavior by these authoritarian regimes? Is there any way you can counter it using media, using social media?
It's interesting. You guys know better than me. So the U.S. has tried a few things. Like in the old days, it was VOA, right? You just pipe it, But people get their, and that's still valuable. And there's an argument that budget has been pulled back too much in those places. In social media, you have the problem with if it has a U.S. stamp on it, right, then it is easily targeted, right? So you want to back civil society.
In a lot of ways, it's not as credible if they see that as well.
Right, exactly. It also makes it a target of the government. So you want to back it without making it clear that it's the U.S. It's a tough balance. I remember with Iran, the U.S. provided a tool to get around internet controls. It kind of subtly got a tool, what's it called? Proxy, so that kind of thing. And they've used that in other countries. That's really clever. That kind of stuff. But it's hard to get it right because if you're identified, then the folks using it are identified as tools of the West, and you don't want to put them at risk, right?
Although I was doing a story about gaming, which I tend to like to do. Mm-hmm. I like subgroups. And the gamers explained to me that in 2013, the Obama administration lifted sanctions on 4 countries, Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and somebody, I forget what the 4th one was. Anyway, they allowed for the first time Facebook and Twitter and those platforms to come into those countries. Those governments didn't want that to happen, but the internet did expand a bit. And who jumped on were the gamers. And because gaming can be international, all of a sudden Iranians were out on every platform they could be on. and they were talking to people around the globe. And so you have to ask yourself, okay, nobody planned that, but it was probably a democracy promotion in ways
Right.
that you wouldn't exactly call it that, but that is what happened.
Yeah.
YouTube, in Saudi Arabia, stand-up comedy has become huge. And how that happened was because of YouTube. These things happen organically, and some things cannot be planned, and you can't even jump on them and help
And from
them.
the government. These are all done
It's all
on the
grassroots.
grassroots. Yeah.
But, you know, it occurs to me that this country is so focused on democracy promotion. It's kind of our, you know, our secular religion, and we all believe in it. But it may be more beneficial to focus more on freedom of the press. The whole idea of democracy promotion got sullied in Iraq.
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, it would be beneficial to have that be the focus more than democracy promotion, because that's tangible. You can try to promote it. You can help people who are trying to practice it. You can call out governments who are trying to get it. It is just in my mind, a smarter, perhaps it's because I've been a professional journalist my entire life, and that's my secular religion, that might be worth exploring.
What do you think?
No, I totally agree. It does have to be organic, because otherwise it comes across as fake. I mean, people know if, you know, the U.S. is behind something, like some of the media channels they push in Iraq. I mean, it's so clearly one-sided and kind of telling a certain kind of story that, you know, people just, you start to know, like, who runs which channel or who's behind what. So it really has to come from the ground. And, you know, and the people, whether it's, you know, people who surprise you, like through online gaming or other methods, I mean, the local journalists, local activists, local people who you work with and you meet, they're pretty ingenious in terms of trying to figure out ways to get around certain limitations. I mean, obviously, certain controls are harder than others, but I'm always pleasantly surprised at how much people do get the word out, whether it's, you know, all of a sudden like almost like a flash mob protest somewhere at a square, or other things like that you know, they figure out and how to do it on their own.
Deb, do you see any evidence of this in southern Turkey, in the refugee camps there, on getting some information back that's done on the organic level?
Well, it's hard to say if that's organic or not. It appears to be organic, although it is not. It's U.S. funded, it's British funded, but there are 15 private radio stations along the border that are beaming in information. In this case, from what I can see, the governments have been very hands-off, and these Syrians are taking it seriously. They are good journalists. Their problem is not the regime. Their problem is Nusra, is the Al-Qaeda people, and so they've pulled back on some of their reporting. But what they do to get people to listen is they give currency statistics. Because in the end of the day, if you live in Idlib, that's what you need to know. What's the dollar worth against the lira? And so that's the top of, every 15 minutes they'll tell you. And that
We have the
brings,
weather here, they have the lira
that's
there.
exactly what, it's currency. And they, you know, they talk to people, they give people a voice inside, you know, rebel-held territory. Some are bigger than others, some are more popular than others, but this has now been going on for 4 or 5 years. The problem for them is the Turkish government is beginning to come down on them. They don't like them. And it's kind of an untold story of a bit of tension between Western governments funding Syrian journalists inside Turkey. But there have been towers snuck in. They've gotten all the way down
Are
to...
they being critical of the Turkish government, any of these?
Sometimes they are.
Sometimes, yeah.
Yes, sometimes they are. You know, they've snuck into Damascus and put towers on the side of mosques. So they like have pop-up radio stations that you can find. But it's been very clever. It's a hard story to tell because nobody wants to tell it. Nobody wants to talk about it because if you bring attention to it, then it all shuts down.
It shuts down,
It
yeah.
all shuts down.
Yeah, yeah. Let's go to some questions. Any questions? Oh, we got lots of them. Yeah, we got a microphone over there.
Hi, I'm John Zemko with the Center for International Private Enterprise. I'm Regional Director for Latin America. In my particular part of the world, there's been some interesting innovations on the part of authoritarian regimes as regards, the media. One is, for example, in Ecuador, where they basically use anti-media laws to prosecute journalists for stories that they write. In Venezuela, we've seen just flat out buying of media companies, either by the government or government-aligned business groups. And then in Argentina, at least before the change of government, they were using the judicial system to control government advertising revenues to the media, or breaking up the media groups using the judicial system. So I don't know if you've seen these sorts of trends
All
in other
of those
parts
tricks.
of the world.
All of those tricks. Those are the standard tricks.
And that gets back to Jim's point. It doesn't matter what region in the world you work in or seen, these tools are identical wherever you go.
But
Unfortunately.
it goes back to this idea that they want to be legitimate, so they use the law. Or
create a law.
you're the NGO, I think we need to examine your books, or I think you have some fire code violations. It used to be that everybody just got swept up and went to jail. They don't do that as much anymore. It's much more subtle.
I mean, this was a while ago, but when I was living in Cambodia, I was sued by the foreign minister for $1 million because I said he had been a former member of the Khmer Rouge, which he was, and he didn't deny. He just was upset that I actually published it. So because it's foreign minister, it's a legitimate lawsuit, or at least it was seen as one. So I then had to be pardoned by the king. So, so he went through the legal means, and I guess I also had to do that as well. But yeah, there's a lot of tricks in the trade for that.
Again, it's good. We don't see threats against journalists here
Never.
in America either. So it's just
Yeah,
it's
No,
always
that doesn't happen.
comforting to know that hasn't jumped.
Yeah.
Exactly. You?
Hi, my name is Insan Cho, and I'm an intern at Public International Law and Policy Group. My question is related to a recent trend in news media organizations worldwide. So there's been, in the past decade, in both democratic and authoritarian countries, a lot of news organizations have been globalizing their operations by setting up branches in other countries, publishing their articles in different languages, airing their shows in new languages. Now, there's been CCTV America here, and I see RT's ad on American cities, and their articles show up a lot in Google searches, and New York Times is publishing articles in Chinese. So do you think this trend has or will have any impact on reshaping the journalism culture in both democratic and authoritarian countries?
I suppose I would go back to what Syrians told me in 2010. If you can't control the information, you must control the people. You can publish all day long in Chinese in the New York Times, but the question is, will audiences read it? And I don't know if there's any statistics to tell us that yet.
No, go ahead. You.
Thanks. Thank you very much for your comments. This has been very insightful. I work on an emergency assistance team for journalists and other press media at risk worldwide. And many of our partners, whether the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Without Borders, or there's literally dozens of press freedom organizations, but everything that all of you have said about the tactics that are used against journalists and media and how they kind of jump borders is absolutely true, because different state or others take a page from one another. And I would definitely emphasize what you're saying is like focusing on attacks on the press or freedom of the press, because that's an indicator of what's happening in civil society. So we all of the groups, because we all work in concert to help journalists, in real time we see what's happening on the ground well before it's going to come up in any coverage. But when you see attacks on the press, that's a direct link to something else that's going on, whether business or otherwise. So I think it's very important, this panel, And I would also encourage, as I know you all do, but when there is different types of attacks or restriction on the press, to also do those stories so that people have an understanding of how it literally connects directly to what else is going on in a society.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because I want to introduce Karina Orlova. She's the Russian journalist I talked about a while ago, who literally left Russia because of death threats. And if you can kind of tell just briefly your story.
Oh, yeah. Hi. But I left Russia because of death threats. It has nothing to do with enterprises or businesses. No, it was Chechens, and it happened after Charlie Hebdo attack. And Ramzan Kadyrov, who's a Chechen leader, publicly threatened Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He's a former political prisoner. So I hosted a program, and I just questioned my guest if Ramzan Kadyrov violated the criminal code, and so if something should be done about that. Yeah. And that's actually, I have a very good example of how Russia censors search. Because last year, the Kremlin spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, got married. And a picture of him was taken, and he had a $500,000 watch wearing. And it was, boom, he's a spokesman. And there is a search system in Russia, Yandex. It's our own Russian Google, and it's way bigger than Google in Russia. But Peskov translates into English like send, it's so when you try to search Peskov's watches, it's in Russian, it sounds like sand clock, because watch and clock is the same word. And you saw pictures of just literally sand clocks, and there were no Peskov, no his $500,000 watches, just like sand clock, sand watch. I don't know how to say. Oh, yeah, that was brilliant, wasn't it?
Yeah. You wonder how they did that.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ethan from Project on Middle East Democracy, and I have a question about the developments in Egypt. Earlier, you all said that regimes have gotten a lot more subtle and a lot better at controlling the media, and I'm wondering why the current regime in Egypt seems so heavy-handed compared to their predecessors.
Because nobody is calling them on it.
Yeah.
There's no consequence that I can see. And it's old style for them. It's the military. So
Business as usual.
They haven't been in power a long time to develop more subtle ways. But I rarely see anybody call them on it.
Yeah. Well, and I also think, don't, at least from my perspective, don't mistake subtle for eliminating blunt force, because in a lot of these places you see both. You see a subtle and clever use, for instance, of controlling searches on the internet, but at the same time, I mean, Turkey is not being subtle when it gets every journalist who covers the prime minister fired, right, or kicked out of the country or sued. One of my friends here is a Turkish journalist. He's been sued by Erdogan, right? I mean, and in Russia, you've seen journalists killed, threatened, and in China, you see loads put in prison as well. So the subtle is blended with the blunt, and it doesn't mean that they're not pulling punches in places other than Egypt.
But also to Deb's point as well, I mean, with Turkey, there are countries or groups who you would expect would be more vocal, but because of the migrant crisis and the deal that the EU has done with Turkey, they probably are, a bit more quiet than they normally would have, which is really disappointing given what we are seeing happening there. But because certain governments don't want to see this flow of migrants coming their way. And Erdogan has threatened if he doesn't get his way, he will just open the borders and let everyone go. And they're facing slow growth in their own economies. They don't want to deal with that, so they're turning a blind eye to what's happening in various places.
Just following up on the Egypt question, my name is Alyssa. I'm a press officer with the refugee advocacy organization here, and I'm curious about countries that the U.S. has significant ties with, such as Egypt, and where the U.S. government possibly has a space to be speaking out against clampdown of press freedom. So specifically looking at the amount of military aid and other aid that we are giving to Egypt, and then kind of parallel to that, kind of a really interesting example where the U.S. did come out in an interesting way was Uganda recently had elections and shut down social media, and actually the U.S. Embassy Twitter handle was really out there and speaking out about what this means and why we should be supporting journalists in a way that I actually haven't seen, an embassy coming out on social media in that way. It was really interesting. I'm not sure if you're familiar. So I'm curious if you can remark on places that the U.S. government has significant ties and where possibly we could be doing more, if anything, that you see the State Department doing.
Well, I mean, these guys know more than me, maybe, but I think it's so inconsistent, right? It's so inconsistent. Just the example of when embassies become vocal on issues. You will see it in some places, usually the minority, and then in other places, I'll just remember when I was in China, a embassy staffer in Shanghai tweeted something about June 4th, and there were big, which is a fact of history, right? It happened. And it didn't get proper permission, and of course, the Chinese government went ballistic, and that State Department person was sanctioned in some way. It wasn't fired, but was beaten up, beaten up for it. I mean, you do see, and then you look at a place like Egypt where, I mean, the U.S. they delayed some helicopter shipments, I think, around the time of, the third or fourth violent crackdown on protests, in history, and then they came. I mean, you see that leverage applied sometimes and not. I mean, listen, in every country, it's a difficult judgment and balancing interests, right?
That's what it really comes down to.
It does.
National
Uganda,
interest.
and how much trade do we have with Uganda? China, we got a lot of trade. Egypt, we rely on them in the fight against ISIS. Uganda's kind of an easy target.
Yeah.
So
it really
Turkey, you like Turkey on the refugee issue, and plus we need them for NATO, so we're not beating them up. I mean, when's the last time you heard a U.S. official tweet or make a public comment about the crackdown on Turkish journalists? I haven't heard it.
It all boils down to politics and national interest, really.
Yeah.
If we haven't talked about this case yet, but in Malaysia, there's a huge corruption case going on with the country's leader, a total crackdown on the media, attorney general on down, fired and replaced with people who are close to him. And frankly, the U.S., which is usually pretty aggressive when it comes to, extending sort of the global arm of U.S. justice, whether it's FIFA or other things, has not done that as much in the Malaysia case. And strangely, it's places like Switzerland and Singapore, which are usually way behind the U.S. on these kinds of cases, have actually been more aggressive. And it's because, partly because Malaysia has been a vital partner in, on ISIS, but also I think in trying to counter China in the South China Sea. So, you actually saw Obama meet with Prime Minister Najib not too long ago as this corruption case was swirling around him.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Hi, speaking of Singapore, I'm an intern at the Washington Report for Middle East Affairs, and I wanted to talk more on the example of Singapore just because I feel like we've talked a lot about authoritarian regimes, but we've never talked about Singapore. And it's obviously a illiberal democracy, but it's one that's thriving. And every time you look at the media, for every one report there is on corruption in Singapore and like how it stifles the press, there's like 10 talking about how it's a great country. It's one of the best examples in Asia for economic development. And I'm wondering if you could comment on the hypocrisy in that situation, because there are so many businesses who have so many investments in Singapore and governments who are interested in investing in Singapore that they overlook the complete lack of press. There are 2 English media presses in there. You can't protest in Singapore. Like, there is complete censorship there, and yet, like, we don't see anyone in the West talking about it. And I think it sets a really bad precedence for any developing country, because you're showing that economic development is something we're worth giving up, like any kind of press freedom. So.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right, and that's a great point. I mean, I know a lot of Western news organizations who have pretty big bureaus there, especially if you cover business and economics. And yeah, they rarely cover some of the oppression of the media there, because frankly, they need to be there because they feel like it's a global hub, especially in that region. If you're going to be there, you basically need to be in Singapore. And so there's unfortunately a lot of trade-offs. I mean, even in basic countries, I mean, democracies, Jim was talking about, stuff that happens here in the US. When I lived in Korea, I mean, the conglomerates there, the Hyundais of the world, the LGs, routinely gave out gifts to local journalists. It's just kind of their MO. And because I'm Korean American, they kind of thought I would be, sort of in that group. And when I wouldn't accept it and then wrote some critical stories about them, they kind of felt like I should have been a national champion. And, I'm a daughter of Korea. How could I write something bad about them? So it happens in a lot of places. Obviously, some places more than others. But that's a great point.
Any other questions? Yeah, in the back. We got two of them over there. Oh, and over here too.
Hey, my name is Wei Hua Li. I'm a Chinese student studying journalism at Boston University. So I was joking that I'm living proof of alternative reality because I never learned about June 4th before I come to the U.S. and that's kind of like a slap to my face when I first learned about that. So my question is, as someone who grew up in a authoritarian regime, who studied the principle and practice of journalism in the U.S. and who wished to return to China after graduation to be a journalist, what suggestions do you guys have? Because right now, everyone is discouraging me to pursue this career if I decide to go back to China.
Goodness gracious. Oh my God, you all turn to me. God, I mean, my heart says I want you to go back and be a groundbreaking journalist in China, right? I do. And but I also know that there are real consequences when you push the limits too far there. And it's a balance you have to make. I mean, to some degree, all journalists have to do that. I mean, we have risks that we take. I mean, here it's different, don't have much chance of getting put in jail here in the U.S., but it happens. Or you get sued, or you get accused of bias, right? And does your organization back you up? We'll see.
And
we'll see
harassment too, from time to
Imagine
time.
this in a Trump administration. If he accuses a front row White House correspondent of being biased against him and then shuts that organization out of the White House, what does that organization do? That's a question. We'll see what happens. It's obviously not the same as being thrown in jail for 15 years, but we'll see. I mean, there are risks, I think, of David Gilkey with NPR, right? That's a different kind of risk that you take to get the story, and we've all taken those risks in nasty places, and we're lucky to be sitting up here, that we didn't lose roulette. So there are those risks as well. But like I said, my heart says one thing, but my mind would say just be careful, right?
There was a question over here too. Yep, right in front. Okay.
Herb Rose. I'm going to ask an overly broad question about freedom of the press. Normally, when that term is invoked, I think of the First Amendment. And that usually involves what is permitted by the country that you live in, how much freedom of the press you have. But after sitting here for a while today, it sounds like there is self-imposed freedom or lack of freedom of the press, determined perhaps by the pressure brought directly by the country that you happen to be reporting on, and self-imposed by perhaps the degree of freedom you think you have. Should we consider an alternate term, or should freedom of the press be redefined? Maybe a lot of people here already have thought in these terms of the self-imposed freedom that you have. I guess I really didn't think about that before today.
Before we go there, can I just say one more thing to the Chinese journalist? You can't unlearn what you know now about June 4th. You can't. And so the experience here has changed you. And because you're Chinese, you'll also know how to navigate. So that's not exactly advice, but that you're asking these questions, that you understand about alternative realities, means you know that you have a mission. And everybody who goes back pushes a little. And that's not a bad thing. Even we make compromises.
Yeah.
It's different in the way that it works in the Western media. It's, at the moment right now, could we get anything on about Syria? No, because it's elections all the time, and I'm often angry about that. There's a lot of other news that we are missing because we are overwhelmed, and there's no balance in the coverage. It's, everywhere. So all journalists have some issues that they're dealing with. Yours will be different. But you came here to study journalism, so you already had it in your head. I don't know how to answer your question.
Any other questions? And we're going to have to wrap up. One last one.
Hi, Amy Johnson. I'm a consultant here in DC working on international development issues and previously worked in media foundations. And I don't want to open up a new stream, but I feel like we haven't really talked about Duterte in the Philippines, and he's made some unusual comments in the last couple of weeks. And perhaps, in my mind, he seems like a bit of an amalgamation of all of the political figures we've talked about directly or indirectly, and I'm just curious if anybody on the panel has thoughts about or anticipations of how things might unfold in the Philippines in the coming years.
I don't know it.
I guess the one thing I worry about is because they have an Islamist extremist problem there too, and that the U.S. does rely on them as a partner on that front, that they won't be as aggressive in trying to combat some of those kinds of statements. And I, unfortunately, I would be scared if I was a journalist there.
Any other question? Okay.
Hi, I'm Glenn Marcus from the Press Freedom Committee here at the National Press Club. I just want to thank all of you and thank CIPE for being here. And to our journalist friend here, if anything does happen to you, all of us in the international journalism protection community will be there for you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming. This is a great pleasure for me. It reminds me how much I miss the profession. And always report. I'll always be a reporter. I think like a reporter. But and everybody knows what I'm talking about up on this panel. So, but let's give everybody a round of applause here. Really, really good. Again, thanks so much.